I'm starting to get a little bit worried now. I'm just looking up the sky, thinking it might be a bit of rain soon, but I hope I can get through this bit of the service before that happens. So the people of Israel had escaped Egypt. Well, actually Pharaoh had decided to let them go, and now he's had a change of mind and he's set out after them with his army. And as the Israelites were escaping, God decides to turn them round and set them on a collision course with the Egyptian army until they're led into a position with the Red Sea on one side, a harsh wilderness and the Philistines on another, an impassable barrier of mountains in front of them, and then hot on their heels, Pharaoh. And they were stuck with no place to go, nowhere to turn. And they called out to God, didn't they, through Moses, "Why have you brought us here to die? We could have done that back in Egypt." And here's the first point I want to make about God's plan, and it's that they're not always logical as far as we're concerned. I think part of that problem is that we don't know the big picture while we're going through this, but we believe in a God who knows things beginning to end. But why would God order his people to backtrack? Sure, it would lead them away from this potential danger of another enemy in the Philistines, but he would send them back straight into the clutches of the pursuing army. Their future looked impossible and their present seemed impassable. But it's into this very situation that God has led them. And we need to ask the question, why? One commentator, F.B. Meyer, says this: "Often God seems to place his children in positions of profound difficulty, leading them into a wedge from which there is no escape, designing a situation that no human judgment would have permitted had it previously been consulted. The very cloud directs them there. You may be involved in a situation like this at this very hour. It does seem perplexing and mysterious to the last degree, but it is perfectly right. The issue will more than justify him who has brought you there. It is a platform for the display of his almighty grace and power. Not only will God deliver you, but in doing so, he will give you a lesson that you will never forget." God was trying to create a nation, and the people of Israel needed to know that God was on their side, and God needed to prove that to them. He was given birth to this new nation, and he needed his people to trust him, to know that he would deliver them from the most impossible of situations. And as we see the way history has worked out through Jesus Christ, we need to see that God can deliver us from the most impossible situation. And the most impossible situation that any human being can face is death itself. But you might feel like that yourself. You might feel like those Israelites did at that time, that you're in an impossible situation. And if you are, I just ask you, just as like it said in that reading, just be still and see what God will do. Allow God to deliver you from that situation, and he might deliver you in a way you really don't expect at all. The second bit of God's planning is that they're always made in advance. As I said before, God doesn't do a knee-jerk reaction to a situation. He doesn't have a plan B. He's got a plan A. We may not understand it and see it all the way through, And God wasn't surprised about what was happening to the people of Israel. The fleeing Israelites were escaping Egypt from the obvious route, and they were going north to Sinai, to the peninsula, along a well-travelled road. But God knew how it would end before it ever began. It says in Revelation, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. God is outside of time. It's difficult for us to understand this. He sees it all, the beginning and the end. Psalm 139 says this, before a word is on my tongue, you know it, Lord, completely. God needed to deal with both Israel and Egypt in setting up of this new nation and in freeing the people of Israel. Israel needed to understand that God was in charge. And as for the Egyptians, to have a superpower living next door to a slave nation that has just escaped would always be a threat to the nation of Israel. God had a plan for that nation. Whether we agree with God's plan or not doesn't matter. God had a plan for that nation. He removed the threat and he gave Israel a chance. The plagues, and in particular the death of the firstborn, would not be for nothing. The people of Israel were afraid because they focused on the wrong thing. They had their eyes on the Egyptians and not on God. They were afraid because they couldn't see the truth that God was with them despite their presence, despite the presence of the cloudy and fiery pillar. And we do the same, don't we, as believers? We sometimes regret stepping out in faith because we don't like the places and situations that faith leads us into. We might be in a situation where we've been diagnosed with a disease and there's no cure. We might be facing a time where we've just lost a loved one, or where we're struggling to make ends meet in this current economic crisis. We might have just been rejected by a spouse or a partner, or maybe we just lost a job. And in all of those things, we have our backs to the Red Sea, facing an army ready to destroy us. And we stand with our backs to that Red Sea, wondering why God doesn't save us. But God just doesn't see where we are in the here and the now, but he sees where we're going if we trust him. There's a beautiful story about Gladys Aylward, as she led more than 100 orphans over the mountains towards free China, escaping the tyranny of the invading Japanese army. And grappled with despair as never before after a sleepless night, she woke facing a morning without any hope of reaching safety. She was in complete despair, and she'd given up. And one of the children reminded of her of this story of Moses and the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. And Gladys Aylward cried out in desperation to that child, "But I am not Moses." And the little girl who was speaking to her said, "Of course you're not, but God is still God. I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm, plans to give you hope and a future." The third point I want to make is that God's plans don't need our help, they just need our obedience. This is what he said to the Israelites: don't be afraid, stand your ground and you'll see what the Lord will do to save you today. That was God's promise to Moses and the Israelites. and it is promised to us too. But it's often the hardest thing for us to do, isn't it? Because we become so self-reliant, so self-sufficient, so reliant on all of these other things around us, that we think we can sort out the mess we often find ourselves in. But often we need to wait on God. Those instructions from God, don't be afraid, stand your ground, and you'll see what the Lord will do for you today. They're all directed at our natural human response of fear, flight and fight. But God's answer is have faith. Have faith and keep moving on. And the last point is that God's plans aren't limited to what is humanly possible. We're told that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind. He made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided so that the children of Israel could cross the sea on dry ground. There's been many attempts by scientists, to come up with an explanation for parting of the Red Sea, not to any great satisfaction. And I guess many will struggle to get to the bottom of the Red Sea crossing for years to come. But the conclusion might simply be, as Jesus once said, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. As difficult as it must have been for the people of Israel, that journey to the Red Sea with their backs to the water, facing that enemy army, was just as much part of God's plan as the miraculous crossing to freedom and new life was. When we're faced with the difficulties of life, we need to see that these can be our highway to the promised land. Why does God allow these bad things to happen in our lives? I don't know that we can fully answer that, but maybe one of the reasons is that because through them we're forced to look up to God. Through them we're forced closer to Him. And through that closeness we can endure the hardship that we're facing. I don't know about you, but I know that whatever I face in this life, at the end of it, I'm expecting a miraculous crossing to freedom and new life. Do you remember as Jesus stood on that boat in the storm on Galilee, as he calmed the wind and the waves, he said to his disciples, and he says to you and to me, don't be afraid, have faith. Amen. Rain's managed to stay off. Hopefully it'll stay off for the prayer too. We're going to sing again now, and then I'm going to lead us in some prayers of intercession.